Hey everybody, this is Darren Van Dam and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that helps you get more out of movies, and today I want to tell you about the 20 scariest movies you can currently catch on Hulu. So, longtime subscribers may have noticed I am burning through a ton of horror movies. About 100, actually a little more than 100 to be exact. This is one of my final lists. There will be a Netflix list soon. But unlike some of my other horror movie lists that feature like hidden gems and lesser known movies, here I'm focusing on the scariest movies you can currently watch on Hulu, and they're ranked in order more or less of how scary they actually are. Before we get to the end of this video, I will share with you some horror comedies in case you need to watch something a little bit lighter, because some of these are pretty intense. But let's go ahead and start all the way at the back with my number 20 pick, which is barely a horror movie, but it is pretty frightening. It's called The Clove Hitch Killer. Now, I have talked about this one on the channel before, but in this one, a young man, a Boy Scout to be a little more exact, starts to suspect that his father, played by Dylan McDermott, might actually be the Clove Hitch Killer, a sort of famed serial killer that was never caught in this small town where they still recognize the victims, and he starts to investigate and uncover some things that seem to be pretty nefarious and dark. Now, like I said, not really a horror movie, but it's got some true crime elements. It is a work of fiction, but it does have some frightening elements to it. But I do have it all the way back at the list of 20. We get much scarier as we approach number 1. My number 19 pick is called Scenic Route. Route. It's Route. Scenic Route. And this is about two friends that get lost out in the desert. More precisely, they run into some car trouble and they're just trapped basically on an abandoned road and begin to slowly lose their minds. This one is a very, very simple concept, and it has a very simple delivery. And in all honesty, it really may have served better as sort of a short film or short subject, because it does feel like it stretches out a little bit. But if you're the least bit sort of nervous about this type of scenario happening to you, this could be a terrifying movie. But at the very least, it is frightening as it sort of dives into the psyche of these two guys and sort of shows how fragile that actually is and how sort of easily it's disrupted. It's pretty dark stuff. It's one of the darker ones on this list, just not necessarily the scariest. My next pick is actually a pretty good modern day telling of the story of Frankenstein. It's called Depraved, and this is about a soldier who is sort of brought back to life very much in the vein of Frankenstein, yet he's able to sort of go out and roam the streets. And this movie is almost a direct adaptation of Frankenstein. There are some story elements that are quite different, but as far as it just being adapted to modern day, it's pretty true, or pretty damn close to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I found that to be somewhat interesting because I kept trying to sort of like find all the parallels, of which there are plenty, but I was trying to find them all the way throughout. Now, this is a lower budget movie, but considering it is lower budget, they did a good job with some of the makeup effects, because there are some pretty heavy ones in this. But this is not a monster movie. This is actually sort of a sad story about this guy who is unwittingly brought back to life and has to deal with a lot of things, including whether or not he is or isn't an actual person. So this one's a little more sad, and while it doesn't really go for the scares the way most of the other ones are on here, it is still just a dreary sort of dark subject matter, and it is that type of movie. So do not watch this one if you're feeling dark and dreary, because it's only going to make things worse. Okay, now at the top of the video, I did say that these are ranked in order of how scary they are. And my next pick is one of the best movies on this list. I cannot recommend it enough, but it is far from the most frightening. It is foreign language, all the way from Scandinavia, and it is called Let the Right One In. This is about a young boy who learns that a girl seemingly his age in his apartment building is a vampire. And it's very, very dark because she's got sort of her keeper, her familiar, her father figure that goes out and collects people for her to drink, because she's very small and very young. And while she is very strong, she's not as strong as sort of an adult. So this one's kind of sad too. And I promise that's not a theme with this list. But it's sad because, you know, she's this aging being. She's getting older and older over time and maturing, but her body is still very small and she really needs to rely on somebody. So in terms of vampire movies, this one gets major points just for being so different. Now, there is an American remake called Let Me In. It's very well done, very well directed, but it's just never going to have that thing that the original has, and the original is a fantastic film. All right, my number 16 pick is sort of the last one for people who don't want to watch anything super scary, and then we'll get into some scarier things immediately. But Stir of Echoes came out on the heels of The Sixth Sense, and it's very similar in a lot of ways, but not quite as good. This stars Kevin Bacon, and he begins to have these sort of supernatural visions, and they're pretty macabre. There's maybe something very dark and tragic that happened either in or near his house, and he has somehow tapped into it. Now, what's great about this one is it's got a fantastic Halloween vibe. If you're kind of a scaredy cat, but you want to watch a scary movie at Halloween, this could be a really great way to go, because there are some scares in this, but I'd be surprised if this one ever kept anyone awake at night for too long. But this is one of those movies that is fantastic for people who want horror, but are just too scared to go any further on the list. Now, my next pick is a newer release. I think it's only about a year old, maybe a year and a half. It's called The Prodigy. Now, do not get this confused. There are several movies with similar names, but The Prodigy is about a young boy who is exhibiting some very nasty behaviors, and not in a Macaulay Culkin, the good son kind of a way, in a horrifying kind of way. And his parents are trying to not necessarily ignore it, but they're trying to excuse it, and then they're trying to seek help, and that doesn't work. And it just really, if stuff with children freaks you out, this one is going to make you nuts. In fact, they do use a young boy as an actor in this movie, and I'm surprised at some of the stuff they had him do, or at least what it appeared that he was doing. It's pretty nasty stuff, and this is a pretty dark movie, and it's super creepy. In terms of just scare factor, we really jumped up quite a bit going from number 15 to 16 on this list. Now, my number 14 pick is also technically not a horror movie, but it's got a lot of horror movie elements. And if you really look at this movie for what it is and really look at it as something that could really happen, it is horrifying. This movie is called Prisoners, and it's actually directed by Denis Villeneuve, who went on to do Blade Runner 2049 and the new Dune movie set to release whenever COVID allows it to be so. But Prisoners stars Hugh Jackman and Terrence Howard as fathers whose daughters go missing. They're basically abducted in their neighborhood. Terrifying the way that this is delivered. It does not feel like your basic sort of like Lifetime original movie where the kids go missing or anything. It really does have sort of just a sense of dread tied to it. And then the movie goes much further as these fathers try to find out what happened. Meanwhile, a detective played by Jake Gyllenhaal is also investigating the case. So this is a crime movie. It is an investigation movie. It's a detective movie, but it's just sort of coated in this sense of darkness, very much like a horror movie. In fact, had this just been sort of filmed a little bit differently, it wouldn't have been better, but it easily could have been transformed into a 100% horror movie with the exact same script, which is why it makes the list and why it lands where it does, even though it is one of the best movies on this list. Now, immediately back to horror on this list is one of the only horror movies, in fact, the only horror movie that Denzel Washington ever did, and one of, I think, only two that John Goodman ever did. It's called Fallen. And in this, Denzel Washington plays a detective as well, but he is tracking down a murderer. But unlike movies like Seven, the murderer in this one is actually a demon that is able to transfer from body to body. Now, that's not a major twist. It's actually set up in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the movie, and it makes for a really disturbing setup because this demon is up to some nasty business. He likes killing people in awful ways and is able to just jump into another body, making him basically undetectable until Denzel gets on the case. This one does have elements of other movies like Seven, where it does feel more like a detective movie, but the demon aspect is really sort of frightening. And then you get some really incredible performances from both Denzel and from John Goodman. He really stands out in this as well as a supporting role, but If you never saw this one's kind of a classic now. It's been a little bit forgotten about maybe, but it's still a gem. I have watched it in recent years and have liked it just as much back when it came out. Now, another more recent release on the list that's only, I think, maybe 2 seasons old is Ghost Stories. Now, this is an anthology film with some really fantastic actors, including some comedy actors that do incredible work here in the horror genre. But these are tied together in a way that you don't normally see in anthology films, and I liked that a lot because anthology films, for the longest time, tend to do sort of one thing. It's a presentation of, say, 4 different short stories. Ghost Stories is no different, but they tend to tie together with some sort of like little loose story just so there's a little bit of glue there, and that's okay. It's fun. It works. Ghost Stories does this weird thing where you don't know what's what, and you don't know what's real, and you don't know what's one of the anthology stories and what's the story that's holding things together, and it works. It's really incredible. I know that's weird and confusing the way I said it, but if I describe it anymore, I'm gonna kind of spoil some stuff for you. If you love anthology, horror anthology, like I do, because you can cram so many different stories into one 90-minute experience, Ghost Stories is one of the best ones to have come out in recent memory. And then we will wrap up my bottom 10 with a fantastic classic horror movie. That's Clive Barker's Hellraiser. Now, if you've been watching all of my horror recommendations this season in particular, you'll know I've been recommending a lot of Clive Barker, including Nightbreed and The Midnight Meat Train, but Hellraiser is easily his most famous movie or movie series because there are several. The first is a classic for a reason. It's got some classic sort of H.P. Lovecraft, Demons from Hell type stuff mixed with just this very specific tone that Clive Barker has. And this movie's drenched in that, which is why I think horror fans, particularly Clive Barker fans, love Hellraiser so much. And while it is very hard to explain, one way of explaining it is to say like Pinhead is the demon in Hellraiser, and while there are others, he's very much still in the vein of like Freddy Krueger and Jason, but he's not a rip-off of them. He has his own sort of thing going on that does get referenced in some other movies. I love how it feels like it belongs with A Nightmare on Elm Street, but also is completely its own thing. I know that's vague, but trust me, if you want some good classic horror this season, Hellraiser is a fantastic way to go. Now, I know what you're thinking, Darren, these are fantastic movie recommendations. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to watch them all in October, but if I do watch them, what am I going to snack on while I watch the movies? I recommend Universal Yums. They are a snack service that you sign up for. You get a box in the mail every single month. It comes from a different country. It's loaded with snacks from different parts of the world, but each box has its own theme from its own place. Not only are there snacks in there, but there's a little booklet with information about all the stuff in there, as well as some little games and things you can play with the snacks. I love it. It's a fantastic experience. I've been through, I think, 6 or 7 boxes now, and I've loved every single one of them. It's just so fun. When the box arrives, I'm excited because I know me and my wife have a date night planned. I will pick out a movie that pairs with whatever country the box came from, and we make a night of it, and it's as fun or more fun than going to the movies used to be, which is not something we really get to do anymore. And I've found this to be just sort of a nice replacement where it feels like we did something. We didn't just sit on the couch and watch a movie. We created like a little event right here at home without ever having to leave the house. Universal Yums boxes come in 3 different sizes at 3 different price points. You can cancel anytime. But use the link in the description, check it out, see if it sounds like it's a good fit for you. I know a lot of you have been enjoying signing up because you let me know in the comments below, which is why they continue to sponsor the show. So thanks for buying from them if you have. But let's go ahead and move on with the rest of this epic horror list.
Damien! Look at me, Damien!
It's all for you!
Now, my number 10 pick is a remake of a very classic horror movie, The Omen. And the only reason the remake even makes this list is because it's almost a frame-by-frame remake of the original. And I think the original, The Omen, is a fantastic horror movie. While I will put movies like The Exorcist above it, it's only because I put movies like The Exorcist at the absolute top, being like the best horror movies ever made. But the original, The Omen, is a longtime favorite of mine, and the remake doesn't break the mold, which sounds a little boring, and it usually kind of is the case. But it's essentially the same movie, almost the exact same script, just shot with modern technology, with new actors, including Liev Schreiber, who I love from Ray Donovan. He's a fantastic actor. And the movie's just got a good look to it, and it keeps a lot of the terror that was inherent in the original, The Omen. I still put the original above the remake, but since it's not available on any streaming services that I've seen this season, the remake is a fantastic replacement for it. My number 9 pick is another anthology film. It's called Southbound. And the reason it beats out Ghost Stories is this one is just much more terrifying. It's way darker, it's bloodier, it's gorier, and it does have some comedy elements mixed in, but it is far from a horror comedy. This one is just creepy as f***, and it's one of the grossest ones I've talked about so far. So if you dig gore and things like that and you like anthology movies, definitely check out Southbound. It is a fantastic Halloween watch. My number 8 pick is a great little hidden gem that I know very few people know about, but I watched it twice. I don't think the same day, but 2 days back to back when I first saw it. It's called Pledge. This is about a group of freshmen, I say group, it's 3 guys that are pledging for a fraternity. And the fraternity, basically, you know the story, you've seen it before. They have no intention of letting these guys in. They just want to torture them. But this story just continues to get darker and darker, and it's really stressful. This one also has some gross out elements, but there are some fantastic performances in here for such a small unknown movie, and really just sort of an uneasy sense of dread throughout that only escalates. And I thought everything was really well delivered in this one. This one was just a surprise of a movie. While I would say there are plenty of other movies I've already talked about on this list that are much better, this one gets major points for just being unknown. And it is scary. It kind of belongs where it is, especially if you put yourself in the right mindset. My next pick was a little bit of a sleeper hit back in theaters when it came out. It did pretty well. It's called Oculus. This is about for lack of a better word, a demonic mirror that tricks you. It makes you think you're seeing things that are not. That is basically the only setup. Now, what Oculus does is it has a lot of fun with a very basic concept, which is what some of the best horror movies ever made have done. They have a simple concept that's easy to wrap your head around, and then they just have a fucking field day with it. And I love that. Anytime it's done well, Oculus is a great example of it being done well. Is it the scariest scenario, a demonic mirror? Not really, but it does make for some really sort of horrifying moments, and if you've never seen it, some very clever, creative, sort of mind-bending moments as well. Okay, so if you're new here, basically what I'm trying to do, if you haven't figured it out yet, is give you an idea as to whether or not each movie is for you. But what I can say is that my next pick is for the least amount of you. But there is a small subsect of you that are going to love this movie, and you're gonna love me for having recommended Goodnight Mommy. Now this is also foreign language, but there is very little dialogue here. What you get is a set of twin boys who are basically latchkey kids. They're just sort of running around, they're running through the woods, they're taking care of themselves because their mother has undergone some form of face surgery, and she is just wrapped up like a mummy and mostly staying in her bedroom. The boys are kind of terrified to look at her, and it's fairly slow paced, but it's all sort of building towards something. And for my crowd that likes spooky art films, this is the way to go. But if you can't deal with something being a little slower, with being foreign language, with sort of really taking its time to get where it's going, this one is going to bore you to tears. If you're that personality type, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's what's going to happen with this movie. But if you like that description of it, there's a very good chance this is going to be sort of your new favorite discovery for Halloween this season. Now, that said, with all the creepiness and darkness that all of those movies carry, and that my the top five scariest movies on Hulu carry, I want to at least recommend something a little lighter. That way you can sort of bring yourself back up, but stay in the Halloween spirit. So here are 10 horror comedies also currently available on Hulu. All right, now we're in the top 5, and you are going to need to watch some sort of comedy after watching my next pick, The House That Jack Built. Now, this is also loosely a horror movie. It definitely qualifies, but it doesn't fit into any kind of mold of a horror movie that you've seen before. But in this one, Matt Dillon plays Jack, who is a serial killer. And you're following Jack around sort of through his major kills, these major turning points in his life. This is directed by Lars von Trier, who does really bizarre, strange movies that people seem to love. But The House That Jack Built seems to be one of his more widely appreciated movies. This one is very graphic, and not in a way that a movie like Southbound is, where you just see a lot of blood and guts. You see some really brutal violence in this movie that is much more visceral than you would normally see in any movie, including movies like Deadpool. You're going to see Matt Dillon strangle a woman, and it's going to feel like you're in the room with him strangling a woman. It's very, very upsetting, but that also is sort of the art of this film, is that you're going along with this guy who is doing some of the worst stuff imaginable, making it one of the scariest movies you can currently watch on Hulu. My next pick was kind of a big deal when it came out, because it came out in theaters everywhere and it horrified everybody. Time has sort of forgotten that, even though they have done multiple sequels to Hostel. Now, I think Hostel sort of wore thin. I think people went nuts for it when it first came out because it was so visceral, and again, just like The House That Jack Built, it showed some really brutal violence. It's a little bit more fanciful here. It's a little bit more in line with a horror movie, where you're not quite as glued to it as you are with The House That Jack Built, but still brutal stuff, and I think people maybe just didn't want to keep rewatching this one over the years. So this is more of a recommendation for people who didn't see it, but this one's very much in the vein of torture porn, yet it's got some really great elements to it that classic horror movies had, one of them being boobs. There are boobs in this one, as well as some of the others on this list, but they're gratuitous in Hostel because it is that type of a horror movie. The good thing about Hostel is that it's very self-aware. So movies get major points from me for just being surprising, but also being very self-aware, and Hostel really falls into that category. My number 3 pick is The Evil Dead 2, which is one of my all-time favorites in the category. I love The Evil Dead. I did a watch live with it back at the beginning of COVID. And The Evil Dead 2 is now on Hulu. I like it even more than the original because it's basically just revisiting the original with way more money, and they learned a lot making the original. So if you don't know, the original Evil Dead is a horror movie classic because there are so many practical effects jammed into that movie, and they invented a lot of stuff during the making of that movie, and nothing else was really like it before. And by practical effects, it's a lot of bloods and guts and demons and makeup and severed limbs and all of that kind of stuff. As well as a lot of haunted house elements, a lot of doors swinging open and shutters and things like that. Moss sort of bellowing with orange glow under it, all of that fun stuff. But then The Evil Dead 2 is essentially the same story with some of the same actors in almost the same cabin, just way, way better. It doesn't necessarily have the charm that the original has, because the original is always the original, but they really brought their A game and did all sorts of crazy, wild stuff with this movie, making it one of my favorite Halloween movies ever made. And then that brings us to my number 2 pick, which is another hidden gem. It's very unknown. It's called The Canal, but this is about a man who walks along this canal every day and starts to see things and have these sort of experiences sort of as he's walking back and forth, and it really sort of builds. Now, this one gets major points again for just being unknown and being a surprise, but also for being really effective at building scares. It's amazing to me how many horror movies come out in theaters and are this big deal that are really awful at building scares. They get sort of a buzzword they can throw on the poster like Ouija, and they don't even have to be that scary, yet something like The Canal can be done with a very small crew and develop this very, very raw sense of dread that will build up throughout. This one is the one to pick if you want to watch something scary that you haven't seen before. And then for my number 1 pick, I'm going with one that I just think is absolutely frightening, and that's Rob Zombie's The Devil's Rejects. This is, I think, easily his best film. It is the sequel to House of a Thousand Corpses, which happens to be available on Netflix right now. They're split up, but you can catch them both in both locations. And I think The Devil's Rejects is much better because whereas House of a Thousand Corpses is just a horror movie, it's basically a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, just from the mind of Rob Zombie. The Devil's Rejects is kind of an epic road movie with these band of marauders, I guess we'll call them, really horrifying people that give these really incredible performances. The villains that he created with this series, not only are they really layered and sort of like detailed and fleshed out, the performances that specifically Sid Haig and Bill Moseley give are just almost like Shakespearean. They're just so elevated above anything you normally see in a horror movie. Plus, there's all this like classic rock integrated with it so well, and it's just got a really sort of unique flavor that honestly I don't think Rob Zombie has been able to replicate. He's come close. He has sort of imitated what he achieved here with some of his other movies in a decent fashion, but he's never really recaptured or recreated it quite like he did with The Devil's Rejects, making it my top pick. In addition to it just being flat out horrifying in almost every way imaginable. So steer clear of it if you are one of those scaredy cats that needs to stick to the first 5 that I mentioned on this list. But I hope you enjoyed this list. Let me know which movies you're going to be watching during the month of October, and also help me thank the Patreon supporters. There is a link in the description if you're interested in becoming a Patreon supporter yourself. There's also a link to become a channel member. They both support the channel equally, but they have different benefits. So if you've been interested in being a supporter of any kind, please check out those links and see which method is best for you. But I will keep making videos like this as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for watching this episode, and you will see me on the next one.